You're listening to Trace Hunt Radio. We explore the darkest chapters of true crime, unsolved mysteries, cold cases, and the twisted minds behind them. Follow the blood, chase the clues, uncover the truth. Stay sharp. The hunt begins now.
On a bright spring morning, the sound of laughter once filled the small town playground. Children ran across the swings, climbed the slides, and dug carelessly in the sandbox, never knowing the dark secret that lay just beneath their feet. For years, parents believed this playground was a safe haven, a place of innocence. But when construction crews arrived to renovate the area, their shovels struck something unexpected. Not rock, not debris, but bone. At first, no one wanted to believe it. But as investigators carefully unearthed the ground beneath the sandbox, the truth became undeniable. A human skeleton, buried directly where children had played for decades. The jewelry found among the remains suggested the victim had once lived in the very community that now watched in horror as their playground was transformed into a crime scene. Who was she? How did her body end up hidden beneath a place meant for joy and laughter? And perhaps the most chilling question of all, who put her there? And why was it kept secret for so long? This is not just the story of a murder. It is a story about betrayal, about silence in a close-knit community, and about the discovery that shattered decades of peace. Welcome to the case of Murder Beneath the Sandbox, a chilling discovery. Chapter 1, The Playground That Held a Secret. We'll open with the setting. The small town, the playground's history, the innocent daily life, then the shocking discovery. This chapter paints atmosphere and delivers the initial impact. It was the kind of playground you'd find in nearly any quiet suburban town. Faded metal swings squeaked with every push. A chipped blue slide, sun-bleached from decades of summers, leaned slightly to one side. The sandbox, though weathered, was always full of toys left behind by children who carried their laughter home at dusk. Parents felt safe here. It was a community landmark, the kind of place where childhood memories were made, and where everyone felt that innocence still lingered. But on an unremarkable Tuesday morning, the soundscape of joy and play was replaced by the harsh metallic clang of shovels. Construction workers had been sent to renovate the playground. New equipment was scheduled to be installed, and the sandbox was due for replacement. The workers chatted casually, digging deeper into the ground than they expected. Then one man's shovel struck something hard, something that didn't sound like stone. At first, they thought it was an old pipe, perhaps part of the park's drainage system. But as the soil was cleared away, pale fragments emerged. Fragile, curved, unequivocal. Bones. The construction site fell into stunned silence. One worker called his supervisor. Another backed away, as if the earth itself had turned hostile. Within minutes, police sirens replaced the chatter of the crew, and yellow tape encircled the playground that had once hosted birthday parties and hide-and-seek. The air grew heavy with unease. Parents gathered at the edges, clutching their children close as whispers spread like wildfire. What did they find? Who was buried there? When investigators arrived, their expressions darkened. Forensic specialists began carefully brushing away the dirt, their gloves stained with soil that hadn't been disturbed in decades. Slowly, the outline of a skeleton took shape. It was female. Jewelry still clung to her wrist, a delicate bracelet, tarnished but recognizable as something once loved and worn with care. Her remains told a silent story, one hidden under the feet of generations of children. This wasn't just a body. This was a secret graveyard, hidden in plain sight. The community's beloved playground had become a crime scene, and for many, it would never be seen the same way again. Chapter 2: A Town in Shock. The moment the first news alert went out, human remains discovered at local playground, the town of Hallowbrook changed forever. At first, it was disbelief. Parents who had dropped off their children just days before now drove past in silence, staring at the yellow police tape that encircled the swings and slide. Some mothers sat in their cars, crying quietly. Fathers clenched their jaws, anger boiling beneath the surface. Children asked questions their parents couldn't answer. Who is under there? Why would someone bury a body in our sandbox? Local news vans swarmed the street within hours, reporters jostling for space, microphones extended toward anyone willing to speak. The once cheerful playground now appeared on every screen across the state. The bright red monkey bars and faded sandbox, captured beneath flashing police lights, became the face of a dark mystery. At the local diner, where gossip always traveled faster than truth, the discovery consumed every conversation. Some swore the bones had been there since the 1960s, a relic of a forgotten crime. Others whispered it was the work of a serial killer who had once passed through town. A few even suggested the victim might have been someone local, a neighbor, a friend, a family member who simply vanished and was never spoken of again. Detective Ellen Marlowe, who led the investigation, knew what shock looked like. She had seen it in the eyes of countless victims' families over her 20 years in law enforcement. But this was different. This wasn't a family's private tragedy. It was everyone's. A murder hidden beneath the feet of generations of children. It wasn't just a crime scene. It was a betrayal of innocence. At the town hall meeting that week, the community gathered, restless and anxious. The mayor stood before them, flanked by police officers and detectives. His voice trembled slightly as he addressed the crowd. "We are working tirelessly with state and federal authorities to identify the victim," he said. "We understand your fear, your anger, and your questions. But please, I ask for patience." His words did little to calm the storm. Parents demanded to know if their children were safe, if the killer was still among them. Elderly residents shook their heads, muttering that the town had changed, that shadows had been growing here for years. Some insisted they remembered screams near the park decades ago, though no one had believed them at the time. Newspapers seized on every rumor. Bones in the sandbox. Small town hides a dark secret. Headlines screamed across front pages, feeding a narrative that turned Hallowbrook into a place of whispers and suspicion. The identity of the victim became an obsession. Every missing persons case from the last 50 years was reprinted, names and faces plastered across social media. For families still living in uncertainty, the discovery reopened old wounds. Phone calls poured into the police station from relatives desperate for answers, hoping and yet dreading that the body might be their loved one. Meanwhile, the playground itself became a kind of shrine. Flowers were laid at the fence, teddy bears propped against the swings, candles flickering at dusk. Parents held their children tighter as they stood silently in front of the tape, as if mourning for the unknown woman who had lain beneath their feet. For the children, the horror was harder to process. 10-year-old Sam Jenkins asked his mother, "Was she down there when we built castles in the sand?" His mother didn't know how to answer. Other kids spoke of nightmares, skeletons reaching up from the ground, whispers under the slide. What was once a place of joy had become haunted. Detective Marlowe watched all of this unfold with a heavy heart. She knew the longer the body remained unidentified, the deeper the fear would grow. The only way to give the town peace was to find the woman's name, to tell her story, and to reveal who had placed her there. The task was daunting. The remains were old, decades old. Records from that era were scattered, many missing entirely. Witnesses had aged, memories faded. But Marlowe believed every crime left a trace, and every secret eventually surfaced. As she drove home that night, she passed the playground. Floodlights illuminated the Sandbox, now a crater surrounded by crime scene tents. Forensics officers still worked inside, their figures bent like shadows in the glow. She slowed the car and whispered to herself, "We'll find you. Whoever you are, we'll find you." What she didn't know then, what no one in Hallowbrook knew, was that the discovery of the bones would not only unearth the story of one woman, but unravel a chain of lies and betrayals stretching back decades. The playground was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Chapter 3. First clues from the grave. The Sandbox was no longer a place for laughter or play. By now, it resembled an archaeological dig, every grain of sand sifted carefully for secrets buried decades earlier. Floodlights hummed through the night, casting pale beams over the forensic tents, as if daylight had been forced onto this corner of the park. Inside the taped perimeter, white-suited forensic experts worked with surgical precision. Each bone was catalogued, photographed, and placed into evidence bags with the gentleness of a sacred ritual. Detective Ellen Marlowe observed quietly, her notebook in hand, as she recorded every movement. She knew that in cases like this, answers weren't shouted, they whispered from the smallest of details. The skeleton itself was mostly intact, curled on its side as if the woman had been placed in a shallow grave without ceremony. The bones were fragile but well preserved thanks to years of dry sand surrounding them. A cracked skull suggested blunt force trauma, though it was too early to confirm whether this had been the cause of death. But what drew everyone's attention wasn't the bones. It was the object found clutched between them. "Detective, you'll want to see this," a forensic officer called out. Ellen stepped closer, kneeling beside the technician. In the woman's skeletal hand lay a small, rusted locket, its chain broken but intact enough to suggest it had once been worn around her neck. Carefully, the officer pried it open. Inside was a faded black and white photograph, a man in a military uniform, his face just clear enough to show strong features and sharp eyes. The discovery sent a ripple of unease through the team. A locket wasn't just jewelry, it was personal, intimate. It meant love, attachment, memory. Whoever this woman was, she had once belonged to someone, and that someone might still be out there. Forensics soon uncovered more. Fragments of fabric, so deteriorated they fell apart when touched, but enough remained to suggest the victim had been wearing a floral-patterned dress, popular in the late 1960s and early 1970s. A shoe sole, cracked and brittle, bore the faint imprint of a long, discontinued brand. All signs pointed to a death that had occurred nearly half a century ago. The town coroner, Dr. Klein, arrived at the scene, his expression grim as he examined the remains. "Female, mid-20s to early 30s at time of death," he muttered. "Blunt force injury to the skull, possibly a hammer or heavy tool. Burial appears rushed. No coffin, no proper layering. Whoever did this wanted her hidden quickly." Detective Marlowe pressed him. "How long do you think she's been here?" Dr. Klein sighed, adjusting his glasses. At least 40 years, maybe longer. But we'll know more once I get her back to the lab. As the body was carefully lifted into a stretcher bag and carried away, Ellen's gaze fell back to the playground. She imagined the decades of children who had built castles, buried toys, and laughed above this grave without ever knowing. The thought made her stomach tighten. Back at the precinct, Ellen and her team began combing through old missing persons reports. Decades of files had to be dug out of dusty archives, many yellowed with age and water damage. Most names led nowhere. Women who had eventually turned up alive, moved away, or whose cases had been resolved. But one case file stuck out. The name was Clara Winslow, reported missing in 1974. Last seen leaving her home after a fight with her husband. No trace of her had ever been found. The details aligned chillingly well. Clara was in her late 20s. Descriptions from family said she had been wearing a floral dress the night she disappeared. She was known to wear a silver locket, a gift from her husband when he returned from military service. Ellen leaned back in her chair, staring at the file photo of Clara, a young woman with gentle eyes and a quiet smile. "It's her," she whispered. But this revelation only deepened the mystery. If Clara Winslow had been buried beneath the playground all these years, who had put her there? And why had no one uncovered the truth until now? The first layer of clues raised disturbing questions. Clara's husband, Arthur Winslow, had claimed for years that she had left him voluntarily. He told neighbors she'd run away to start a new life. Police at the time had accepted his explanation. After all, it was the 1970s, and women sometimes vanished into new towns, new identities. But Ellen knew better. People didn't just vanish without a trace, and they certainly didn't bury themselves beneath a sandbox. As the night wore on, Ellen pinned Clara's photograph to the evidence board. Around it, she placed the locket, the shoe fragment, and the coroner's early notes. The picture was far from complete, but the outline of a story was forming. One of betrayal, violence, and silence that had lasted for decades. Her phone buzzed with a message from forensics. "Detective, the locket photo matches an old military record. The man might be Arthur Winslow." Ellen froze, the implications clear. If Arthur had been the one in the locket, and if Clara had disappeared after a fight with him, then the trail was pointing in only one direction. But there was a problem. Arthur Winslow had died in 1998, so if he had been the killer, then justice would never be served in a courtroom. And yet, Ellen couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't finished, because sometimes, even after death, the guilty leave behind accomplices, secrets, and shadows that continue to haunt the living. And in Hallowbrook, those shadows were just beginning to stir. Chapter 4. Digging into the Past. The Winslow family's secrets. The morning after the grim discovery, Hallowbrook felt eerily normal. Children's laughter once again floated through the park, though the sandbox remained cordoned off, guarded by police tape fluttering in the breeze. Most residents whispered nervously to each other in cafes, shops, and churches. The skeleton beneath the playground had become the town's single topic of conversation. At the precinct, Detective Ellen Marlowe spread out her findings across the long oak conference table. At the center lay the faded photograph of Clara Winslow, taken from the missing persons file. Next to it was a newer file, the obituary of Arthur Winslow, her husband. He had died of a heart attack in 1998, buried in a modest plot not far from the same playground where Clara's body had been found. The proximity unsettled Ellen. It was as if Clara's grave had silently accused her husband for decades, only steps away. "Let's dig deeper into Arthur's life," Ellen told her team. Neighbors, family, military records, financials, anything that tells us who he really was. The first stop was the Hallowbrook Historical Society, which doubled as the town archive. Dusty file cabinets lined the walls, their drawers stuffed with yellowing newspapers, photographs, and fragile documents. Ellen's assistant, Jake, scrolled through reels of microfilm, searching for articles from the 1970s. And there it was, a headline from June 1974. Local woman vanishes. Husband claims she left home voluntarily. The article quoted Arthur Winslow extensively. He described Clara as restless and suggested she needed space. He told reporters he'd last seen her storming out of the house after a marital argument, taking nothing but her purse. The police at the time, lacking both resources and suspicion, accepted his story. There was no sign of foul play, no witnesses. It became just another unsolved case of a woman who had supposedly run away. But the neighbors remembered differently. One elderly woman, Mrs. Callahan, agreed to meet Ellen for an interview. In her cluttered living room, she poured tea with shaky hands. Clara was sweet, Mrs. Callahan recalled, her eyes clouding with memory. Quiet, polite. She loved her garden. I never believed she ran away. That night I heard shouting, Arthur's voice angry, then silence. I never saw Clara again. Ellen pressed her gently. Did you tell the police? I did, Mrs. Callahan admitted, lowering her gaze. But in those days, well, men were believed more than women. The officers told me not to stir up gossip. The injustice made Ellen's jaw tighten. Too many women had been erased by silence and doubt. Later, Ellen and Jake examined Arthur's military service records. They painted a picture of a strict, disciplined man who had served overseas during the Vietnam War. His commendations spoke of bravery, but his medical records told another story. Incidents of violent outbursts, disciplinary notes, and a mandatory psychological evaluation before his discharge. Arthur had a temper, Jake muttered, flipping through the pages. If Clara threatened to leave him, maybe he snapped. But Ellen wasn't convinced it was that simple. Arthur may have killed Clara, but there were gaps in the timeline. Why bury her beneath the playground, a public space? Why not somewhere remote where she'd never be found? The answer, she suspected, was tied to convenience and secrecy. At the time, the playground had been under construction. Fresh soil and sand were being moved in and out daily. If Arthur had access, either through work or connections, hiding Clara's body there would have been shockingly easy. To test her theory, Ellen visited the town's public works department. After hours of sifting through brittle project records, she found what she was looking for. In 1974, the playground had been built by a local construction firm where Arthur's brother, Samuel Winslow, was a foreman. Her pulse quickened. Had Samuel known? Had he helped cover it up? The next interview was with Arthur's now elderly brother. Samuel Winslow, frail and pale in his nursing home chair, looked startled when Ellen introduced herself. His hands trembled as he adjusted his blanket. I knew this day would come, Samuel whispered, before Ellen even asked a question. He confessed he had always suspected Arthur had killed Clara, but he had no proof. Arthur came to me one night, drunk and wild-eyed. He asked me how deep the foundations were being dug at the new playground. He said it was just curiosity. But his clothes, they were stained. I didn't ask questions. I was too afraid. Ellen leaned forward. Did you help him? Samuel shook his head vehemently. No. God forgive me. I didn't help him. But I kept silent. For years, I kept silent, The old man's eyes filled with tears, guilt etched across his face. As Ellen left the nursing home, she felt the heavy weight of generational silence pressing down on her. This wasn't just about Clara and Arthur. It was about a town that had looked the other way, neighbors who had doubted their own instincts, and a police department that had failed to see a crime hiding in plain sight. Back at the precinct, new forensic tests arrived. Clara's bones showed evidence not only of blunt force trauma, but also defensive wounds on her arms, fractures consistent with trying to shield herself from blows. She had fought for her life. And there was something else. Dirt samples taken from her dress contained traces of lime, commonly used in the 1970s by construction crews to stabilize soil. It was conclusive proof that Clara's body had been buried during the playground's construction, and that someone with direct access to the site had placed her there. The walls of the case were closing in. Ellen pinned Arthur and Samuel Winslow's photographs side by side on the evidence board. The story that had been whispered for decades was now screaming in black and white. But a final question lingered like a ghost in the room. Was Arthur the sole culprit? Or had others helped ensure Clara Winslow's silence? The investigation was far from over. If Ellen wanted to give Clara justice, she would need to uncover every secret buried in Hallowbrook, no matter how many families it destroyed. Chapter 5. The town's dark conspiracy, how silence protected a killer. For weeks, the investigation into the skeleton beneath the sandbox had seemed like a solitary hunt for truth. But as Detective Ellen Marlowe pieced together scraps of evidence, she began to realize the case wasn't about just one victim. It was about a town that had chosen to forget, or worse, chosen to look away. It started with old police reports from the late 1970s. Most were faded, some incomplete, as if pages had been deliberately removed. One file mentioned a disturbance near Oakwood Playground, but no follow-up existed. Another referred to unverified complaints of screaming in the night. Each record hinted at something sinister, but every trail abruptly ended. It wasn't incompetence. It felt intentional. When Marlowe interviewed older residents, she noticed patterns in their silence. Some stiffened, their eyes darting nervously, as if certain memories were forbidden to speak aloud. Others brushed her off entirely, muttering, "That's all in the past, best left alone." One woman, frail and trembling, lowered her voice and whispered, "You don't understand. People knew, but no one wanted trouble. No one wanted to cross him." Him. That single pronoun carried weight. Whoever the him was, the fear had lingered across decades. Rumors soon surfaced about a butcher named Gerald Kane. He owned the town's only meat shop in the 1970s, a gruff man known for his temper. Parents often warned children to avoid him, yet he was also respected for his donations to community events, particularly the Playground Fund. The irony was suffocating. The very man who had helped build the Sandbox might have buried his secrets beneath it. Marlowe dug deeper. Kane's records showed multiple complaints. Young women who had gone missing after last being seen near his shop. But each report had been dismissed. Witness statements contradicted, evidence lost. Former officers admitted, off the record, that Kane had friends in high places. He supplied meat for the mayor's banquets, catered police events, and donated generously to political campaigns. The system had protected him, whether out of loyalty, corruption, or fear. The deeper Marlowe went, the more the town's complicity emerged. A retired priest admitted that a frightened girl had once come to him, claiming Kane had lured her friend into his cellar and she never came back. But when the priest raised concerns, he was told not to slander a good man's name. A former teacher recalled rumors of bloodstains on Kane's clothes, but when parents asked questions, the police dismissed it as butcher's work. The silence wasn't passive, it was active. The town had chosen survival over justice. They had traded the safety of young women for the comfort of denial. For Marlowe, the revelation was devastating. The skeleton in the sandbox wasn't just a victim of Kane's brutality. She was also a victim of collective cowardice. The people who should have spoken up had remained quiet. The authorities who should have investigated had looked away. Generations of children had played on the grave because their elders had refused to dig beneath the surface. When Kane died suddenly in 1989, a heart attack behind the counter of his shop, many felt relief. But no justice followed. No investigation, no questions. His name faded, and with it, the town's burden of guilt. The truth lay buried literally beneath children's laughter. Now, with the discovery of the bones, that truth clawed its way back into the light. At a community meeting, Marlowe confronted the crowd directly. "You all want answers," she said, her voice sharp against the silence. "But answers require honesty. People here knew. People saw. People stayed silent. That silence gave a killer freedom. And a young woman, perhaps more than one, paid the price." The words struck like a hammer. Faces paled, heads dropped. For the first time, the town was forced to see itself as complicit. The conspiracy wasn't written in official records, but in the quiet agreements, the whispered warnings, the deliberate forgetting. It was in the way neighbors looked the other way when Kane lingered near young women. It was in the way missing person flyers were taken down too quickly. It was in the way fear was dressed up as respectability. As Marlowe left the meeting, an old man approached her, his cane tapping against the floor. His eyes glistened with tears. "I should have spoken," he whispered. "I knew what he was, we all did. But we were scared. And now it's too late." Marlowe's jaw tightened. "It's not too late. The woman under that playground deserves her name back, and you're going to help me give it to her." That night, as floodlights once again illuminated the excavation site, Marlowe stood at the edge of the sandbox, staring at the exposed earth. The town had buried its guilt along with the bones. But guilt doesn't rot. It waits. It lingers. And now, at last, it was ready to speak. Chapter 6. The victim's identity revealed. DNA, family, and forgotten lives. For weeks, the skeletal remains had remained nameless. The bones beneath the sandbox spoke of violence, but they did not yet have a story. To Detective Ellen Marlowe, that anonymity was the cruelest part. The victim had been robbed not only of life, but of identity. Without a name, she risked becoming just another forgotten tragedy, another statistic. The forensic pathologist, Dr. Adrian Vega, worked painstakingly over the remains. Age estimation placed the woman in her late teens to early 20s. Her bones showed signs of blunt force trauma, a fractured skull, several broken ribs. Some breaks suggested defensive wounds, as though she had fought desperately before the final blow. A faint trace of rope burn circled the wrist bones. Whoever killed her had restrained her before ending her life. But the most chilling discovery lay within the fabric scraps found tangled with the skeleton. Time had ravaged the material, but the faded floral print hinted at a dress. More importantly, pinned inside the hem was a tiny safety pin, unusual but potentially significant. For Marlowe, it was a clue that suggested care, maybe even poverty. Perhaps the young woman had repaired her clothes herself. The breakthrough came from DNA testing. A molar, pulled carefully from the skull, carried enough preserved material for extraction. Weeks later, the results came back. The victim was related to a woman named Clara Jensen, who still lived in a nearby county. Clara, now in her late 60s, was the sister of a girl reported missing in 1978, 19-year-old Lydia Jensen. When Marlowe drove to Clara's modest farmhouse, the reunion of past and present was heartbreaking. Clara answered the door with wary eyes, but when Marlowe spoke Lydia's name, tears welled instantly. "My sister," Clara whispered. "I knew she didn't just run away. Everyone said she did, but I knew. She would never leave me. Never." Inside, Clara pulled out an old photo album. Grainy, fading pictures showed Lydia in sepia-toned happiness, a girl with long auburn hair, mischievous eyes, and a love for singing. She worked at a diner to save for college. She dreamed of becoming a teacher. On the night she vanished, she had been walking home from her shift. She never arrived. The official report had dismissed her disappearance as a runaway case. Police had suggested she'd left town voluntarily, chasing freedom or romance. But Clara never believed it. She had plans, Clara said bitterly. She had hope. You don't just abandon that. As Marlowe listened, a picture formed of Lydia not just as a victim, but as a person. Vibrant, ambitious, loved. The silence of the town, the corruption that had buried Gerald Kane's crimes, had stolen her future and left her family in endless limbo. But the evidence didn't stop at identification. The dress fragments matched descriptions of Lydia's last known outfit. More damning was a discovery in Gerald Kane's old cellar, which had been abandoned since his death. Among the debris, police uncovered a rusted locket. Inside was a tiny photograph of Lydia Jensen, smiling. The locket had been Clara's gift to her younger sister on her 17th birthday. When Clara saw it, her sobs shook the room. "That's hers," she gasped. "I gave it to her. He kept it. Like a trophy." The truth was undeniable now. Lydia Jensen had been Gerald Kane's victim. She had fought, been restrained, killed, and buried beneath the playground he helped fund, a grotesque symbol of his control over the town. The revelation hit the community like an earthquake. The news spread fast. The bones in the Sandbox had a name. Children who had once played there now recoiled in horror. Parents who had grown up with whispered warnings about Kane but had dismissed them as gossip felt the crushing weight of guilt. The town's silence had allowed a monster to kill and hide in plain sight. For Marlowe, the identification was both victory and torment. She had given Lydia her name back, but justice remained hollow. Kane was long dead, beyond the reach of courts or prisons. Yet she refused to let Lydia's story fade again. At a press conference, Marlowe spoke firmly. "This isn't just about Gerald Kane. This is about Lydia Jensen. She was 19 years old. She wanted to teach children. She loved music. She had a sister who never stopped waiting for her. And for decades, her story was buried, not just by dirt, but by silence. Today, we end that silence." The cameras flashed, and for the first time in 45 years, Lydia's face returned to the public. She was no longer a missing girl lost in the archives. She was a victim who demanded remembrance. For Clara, the discovery brought bittersweet closure. She visited the excavation site, laying flowers at the edge of the playground. Standing there, she whispered softly, "You're found now, Lydia. You're not alone anymore." The sight left even hardened officers wiping their eyes. Yet beneath the closure, darker questions remained. If Kane had killed Lydia, had he killed others too? How many more girls had disappeared under his shadow, dismissed as runaways, forgotten in dusty files? The identification of Lydia Jensen was not an ending. It was the beginning of a larger reckoning. As the sun set over the small town, Detective Marlowe knew the case was far from over. Lydia had her name, but the silence that had protected Kane still echoed. And in that silence, there might be more victims waiting to be heard. Chapter 7. More victims emerge, the serial pattern of the butcher. The discovery of a single body beneath the sandbox had been enough to shake the town to its core. For weeks, investigators combed through every scrap of evidence: soil samples, bone fragments, jewelry, and traces of fabric. But as forensic results came back, a more horrifying picture began to take shape. This was no isolated tragedy. The bones were not from just one victim. The sandbox had concealed more than one set of remains. The first breakthrough. It started with the anthropologist's quiet observation. Dr. Heller, who specialized in human skeletal analysis, noticed that the femur retrieved from the pit did not match the proportions of the skull found nearby. At first, investigators thought they might have been disarticulated from the same victim, scattered by time and soil pressure. But further analysis confirmed the unthinkable. The sandbox had covered multiple bodies, not one. The revelation rippled through the investigation like a shockwave. Detectives had to consider the possibility that the killer had used the playground as a dumping ground, returning more than once to bury his crimes under the very space where children laughed and played. Identifying the unnamed. As forensic teams expanded the dig site, two more partial skeletons surfaced. One belonged to a teenage boy, the other to a woman in her mid-30s. Unlike the first victim, their identities were not immediately obvious. Local records of missing persons from the late 1980s and early 1990s were re-examined. Soon, detectives connected the remains to two long-forgotten cases: a runaway teenager who had disappeared after leaving a late-night party, and a mother of two who had vanished on her walk home from work. Both cases had gone cold decades ago, filed away in dusty folders that no one expected would ever be reopened. A serial pattern forms. Patterns began to emerge as detectives laid the timelines side by side. Each victim had disappeared within a few blocks of the same neighborhood. Each had last been seen near the small park that would later house the playground. And each case carried eerie similarities. Victims vanished late at night, without a trace, leaving behind families who never knew what had happened. The notion of a serial killer operating unnoticed in their quiet community was devastating. For years, the park had been a gathering place, a symbol of safety and innocence. Now, every swing, every patch of sand seemed tainted by the knowledge of what had been buried below. Psychological profile. The FBI was brought in to assist, and profilers began sketching the psychology of the killer. Whoever had committed these crimes had shown boldness, returning to the same site multiple times to conceal bodies. He was organized enough to avoid suspicion and blend into daily life, but reckless enough to risk discovery. He likely lived nearby, comfortable enough with the area to believe he would never be caught. The detail that disturbed investigators most was the symbolism of the sandbox itself. To bury victims where children would later play suggested a twisted need for control, a cruel joke against the community, hiding death beneath a stage of innocence and laughter. A town confronts its past. As the press swarmed the town, locals began revisiting memories they had long buried. Some recalled a man who used to watch from the park benches late at night, always silent, always there. Others whispered about a butcher's apprentice who had worked in a nearby shop in the early 90s, a man with a short temper and a strange obsession with knives. He had left suddenly, only to return years later as if nothing had happened. Neighbors, once reluctant to speak, began to share fragments of suspicion they had ignored. A car parked at odd hours, the sound of digging in the middle of the night, a faint smell that once drifted through the block but was dismissed as garbage. With hindsight, every detail seemed damning. The victims' stories return. Journalists dug into the lives of the victims, breathing humanity back into names that had nearly been forgotten. The teenage boy, David, had been a promising athlete, last seen heading home after a school dance. The young mother, Marlene, had been walking back from her shift at the diner when she vanished. Their families, now older, wept as they were told the truth. Their loved ones had not simply disappeared. They had been murdered and hidden in plain sight. The emotional toll on the community was overwhelming. Vigils were held, candles lined the park fences, and photographs of the victims were placed beside the playground where their bones had been unearthed. The innocence of the place was shattered forever, mounting pressure on police. The revelation of multiple victims turned the investigation into a race against time. If the killer was still alive, was he still out there? Could there be more graves hidden elsewhere? Detectives scoured maps, identifying every patch of land the suspect could have used. Ground-penetrating radar was employed around the park and other nearby sites. Each new scan felt like peeling back another layer of horror, waiting for the earth to yield more secrets. Closing in, the case shifted from tragedy to manhunt. Detectives began zeroing in on a handful of names, men who had lived near the park during the years of the disappearances. One in particular stood out. A man who had once worked as a butcher's assistant, who had abruptly moved away after one of the victims vanished. His record showed minor arrests for violence, but nothing that had ever tied him to murder. Yet his proximity to the park, his obsession with blades, and his unexplained absences all painted a chilling picture. The serial butcher. By the time the press caught wind of the theory, the town had already named him in hushed voices. The Butcher. Rumors spread that he had returned to town years later, hiding in plain sight, living a quiet life while the graves beneath the Sandbox went unnoticed. Whether or not the name was accurate, it stuck, cementing the image of a killer who used his skill with knives and his knowledge of meat to dispose of human life as casually as animal flesh. A community forever marked. The knowledge that more than one victim had been buried beneath the playground transformed the case into a legend that would haunt the community forever. Parents kept their children away from the park. Swings creaked in the wind, untended, as if the entire place had been abandoned to the ghosts of its hidden past. Every discovery brought the town closer to truth, but also closer to the chilling realization that evil had not only visited them, it had lived among them, watching, waiting, and striking again and again. Chapter 8. A Town on Edge. Fear and suspicion spread. The discovery of more victims had shattered any illusion that the butcher's cellar was a single, isolated act of horror. This was no accident of history, no long-forgotten tragedy left to the dust of time. It was a pattern, a series, a string of disappearances that now carried names, faces, and grieving families. And with that realization came fear, thick, suffocating, and impossible to shake. The town was small, the kind of place where everyone had once known everyone else's business. Children had grown up playing under the shade of oak trees. Neighbors had borrowed sugar from one another, and the biggest scandals had usually been whispered romances or unpaid debts. But now, the whispers carried a far darker weight. Suddenly, every glance, every familiar face on the street, Every memory of a neighbor's odd behavior decades earlier became suspect. People asked themselves the chilling question no one dared say aloud. Had they lived among a killer for years without knowing it? Shops that once bustled with chatter grew eerily quiet. Parents no longer allowed their children to play unsupervised. Older residents clutched their past even tighter, recalling nights when screams were brushed off as drunken fights, when odd disappearances were excused as people leaving town. The butcher's crimes reframed those memories. Had they ignored the signs? Had silence allowed him to continue? Police patrols increased around the clock. Not because the killer was still active. The evidence pointed to murders committed years earlier, but because fear had warped perception. Every shadow was dangerous. Every sound after dark was sinister. Rumors spread faster than facts, some claiming the butcher had accomplices, others insisting he had left behind a successor. None of it was confirmed, yet the rumors clung to the community like cobwebs, impossible to brush away. Local businesses capitalized on the hysteria in subtle ways. Newsstands sold out of papers with lurid headlines. Bars filled with anxious patrons eager to share theories. Even ghost tours popped up overnight, offering walks through the butcher's town. For outsiders, it was a morbid curiosity. For locals, it was suffocating, the sensation that their grief had become entertainment. Meanwhile, survivors of missing persons cases, long thought forgotten, came forward, demanding answers. Families who had been told their loved ones probably ran away now wondered if they had been victims all along. This pressure weighed heavily on the police, who faced the impossible task of separating truth from speculation. Old case files stacked high on desks, each one a potential thread in the butcher's web. The most haunting part was that suspicion seeped into the most ordinary of relationships. Neighbors who had shared fences for decades now eyed each other warily. Husbands and wives quietly questioned what they truly knew about each other's past. At church gatherings, whispers darted through the pews. Even law enforcement officers were not spared. Some townsfolk wondered if a cop had covered for the butcher, intentionally or out of ignorance. The paranoia had no boundaries. Media attention only fanned the flames. Journalists descended on the town, camping outside the courthouse and interviewing anyone willing to speak. National outlets framed it as the town of secrets, painting residents as complicit in silence. This angered many locals, but also forced them to reckon with an uncomfortable truth. Maybe, just maybe, they had chosen not to see. Perhaps fear of scandal or unwillingness to confront evil had allowed the butcher's cellar to remain hidden for so long. What cut deepest was the way children reacted. Teachers reported that playground games had shifted, no longer tag or hide and seek, but reenactments of the butcher's cellar. Parents tried to shield their children from the news, but kids absorbed fear in ways adults couldn't control. Nightmares multiplied. Drawings of skeletons and locked doors appeared in school art projects. The innocence of the next generation was tainted by crimes committed before they were even born. As the investigation pressed forward, the town became a pressure cooker. Each new forensic discovery made headlines. Each rumor brought a fresh wave of panic. When police suggested that the killer might have been a respected figure in the community, someone no one would have suspected, the tension snapped even tighter. Who among them could it have been? A teacher, a shopkeeper, a trusted family friend? Community meetings turned into shouting matches. Some demanded full transparency from the police, while others argued secrecy was needed to protect the investigation. Trust in authority eroded. Even the mayor, once beloved, was accused of knowing more than he revealed. The butcher's legacy was not only the victims buried beneath his cellar, it was the slow unraveling of a community's faith in itself. And yet, beneath the chaos, determination simmered. Journalists dug deeper, families refused to stay silent, and detectives pursued leads with relentless focus. The town was fractured, but also galvanized. Fear alone could not define them. The truth, however painful, had to be uncovered, no matter how many reputations it destroyed, no matter how many secrets it exposed. The story of the butcher's cellar was no longer just about a hidden room and a series of murders. It had become a mirror held up to the town itself, forcing everyone to ask, what do we choose to see, and what do we choose to ignore? The butcher may have been just one man, but the silence that surrounded him was collective. And as the town braced for the next revelation, one thing became painfully clear. The real horror was not just the cellar beneath one house, but the shadows lingering in every home, every family, every memory. Chapter 9. Truth Unearthed. The evidence that broke the case. By the time dawn bled through the blinds of the incident room, the board looked like a palimpsest of grief. Names, dates, maps, and photographs webbed together by red thread. Detective Ellen Marlowe stood with a paper cup cooling in her hand, eyes fixed on 3 words she'd written in block letters across the center. Who put them there? The answer arrived in fragments. Tool marks and teeth. It started in the lab, under a microscope's circle of hard light. Dr. Heller, the skeletal analyst, angled a rib from the teenage boy beneath the lens. Fine, parallel striations tracked across the cut surface. Not a wood saw, he said softly. This is a meat saw, coarse tooth pitch, 18 TPI, older pattern. He slid a second sample under the lens, then a third. Marlene's humerus, the boy's pelvis, each bearing the same signature. On one cut, a tiny crescent notch interrupted the striations. It's missing tooth, Heller murmured, half to himself. Same blade, same flaw. Whoever did this used the same saw across victims separated by years. Toolmark specialists compared the microstriations to exemplars. The match was maddeningly specific. A mid-century Butcher Co. No. 7 handsaw, discontinued in the late 1970s, frequently sold to meat shops. If they could find that exact saw, with a tooth missing in the same sequence, they'd have a bridge from bone to hand. Sand that remembers. At Parks and Rec, a clerk slid a banker's box across a counter. We keep everything, she said, even when we shouldn't. Inside, ledger books and purchase orders smelled of toner and rain. Jake, Ellen's partner, flagged a thin, onion skin work order from 1991. Resand, Oakwood Playground. Off-hours delivery approved. The contractor's name was stamped at the bottom. Cole Landscaping and Supply. The signature, looping and confident, read Raymond Cole. Cole, the butcher's apprentice that old-timers remembered. The young man who learned his first cuts under Gerald Kane. He had left town soon after Kane's sudden death in '89, then returned in the early '90s to open a landscaping outfit on the east side. Quiet, unremarkable, invisible. Ellen circled the date. If bodies were added to the Sandbox after Lydia's burial in '78, they would have needed access during a resand. Open ground, no questions. She pushed farther. More slips surfaced. 1993, spot sand replacement. 1994, night delivery, gate key issued. Each carried the same signature. The park had been his after midnight. Pollen, lime, and a wheel well. Forensic palynology, the science of pollen, rarely made headlines, but it loved secrets. Soil packed into the wheel wells of a derelict pickup still registered on Cole's business license. an old truck long since parked behind his shop, was caked and dry. A thin core went to the lab. Under magnification, Dr. Vega pointed to a signature bloom pattern: Quercus alba, white oak; Acer rubrum, red maple; and Festuca rubra, red fescue, the exact turf blend parks planted around Oakwood Sandbox in 1991 and 1993. Unique enough? Ellen asked. How unique when you add this, Vega replied, tapping a second slide. Fine white crystals. Hydrated lime. Same lot composition we found bonded to fibers pulled from Marlene's dress fragment. The soil remembered where the truck had been. The crystals remembered what had been mixed into the sand. The face in the composite. Witnesses aged like everyone else, and memories picked up the patina of time. Still, when Ellen laid out photos in a church basement, men who'd lived near the park in the early 90s, two women pointed to the same face. He used to sit on that bench, one said, fingertip hovering over a younger Raymond Cole. Always late, always watching. A retired security guard from the public works yard added a piece no one had known to seek. We kept a set of gate keys in a gray box by the time clock. I saw Cole take one more than once. Said he had overnight deliveries. We didn't keep a log back then. The warrant. By afternoon, a judge signed the warrant. The convoy rolled to Cole's shop, a low cinderblock rectangle at the edge of an industrial lot, its sign sun-faded to ghost letters. Weeds stitched the chain link. A wind chime rasped softly from a nail. Inside, the air smelled of fertilizer and oil. Dust hung in shafts of light. Ellen split the team. Office, loft, tool room, back shed. It took 20 minutes. Detective, an evidence tech called from the tool room. You're going to want to see this. On a pegboard hung a butcher's handsaw, pitted with age, grip worn to bare wood. Butcher Co. number 7, 18 teeth per inch. The fourth tooth from the heel was sheared clean away. Ellen's breath thinned. Bag it. They kept going. In a plastic tote, beneath spools of nylon line, they found a roll of butcher's twine stained brown at the edges. A tarpaulin, folded and crusted, gave up fibers the color of Marlene's coat. In a mildewed banker's box, someone had stacked narrow items wrapped in waxed butcher paper and taped tight, not with careful museum knots, but with quick, practiced dexterity. Under the paper waited small human things: a broken eyeglass arm, a charm bracelet with 4 tiny silver hearts, a train ticket stub to a neighboring town, 1989, a hair ribbon rotted to lace, trophies banal and monstrous. In the loft, Jake found a cigar tin, rusted, its hinged lid reluctant. It popped open to reveal Polaroids, soft focus, overexposed by time. Not bodies, not gore, just photographs of the park at night. The sandbox, a wheelbarrow, a shovel planted like a flag, a pair of boot prints interrupting the smoothness, and in one frame, the edge of a hand at the bottom right, pale in the flash, lifting the camera away too slowly. Ellen stared. He photographed the stage, she said. Not the act, the place, the control, the notebook. In the office, beneath a drawer false bottom, lay a small ledger, cover scuffed, pages ruled. The writing inside was neat and methodical, free of the grandiose bile Ellen had come to expect from killers' private pages. This was logistics, not poetry. Oak, drop L100. Rake smooth. Hose. M, dinner at 1700. Watch back gate. S, no pointsven tooth gone. Order kit. He had even noted the missing tooth. A page later, K, shop keys surrendered. Take what's useful. K for Kane. Gerald Kane, dead in '89. Ellen flipped another page. Bench 3, repeat. Bench 3 was the one facing the sandbox. Witnesses had remembered him there, a steady nocturne figure under sodium light. This ties Kane's end to Cole's beginning, Jake said quietly. He didn't just learn from him at a block. He inherited the theater. The door in the floor. One more discovery waited. In the back shed, behind stacked pavers and a limp hose reel. A rectangle of new plywood sat flush with old boards. An evidence tech tapped it. It rang with the hollowness of leftover air. They pried it up. A crawl space breathed damp and cold. Inside were planks, a hose, a rake, a short-handled spade with sand fused to the blade, and a stained 5-gallon bucket half filled with fine, pale grit. They bagged a scoop. Under the lab's light, the grit matched Oakwood's Sandbox composition from 1991. Same source quarry, same mineral balance. The shed kept a piece of the stage at home. The last link. DNA is unforgiving when it can be coaxed to speak. The butcher's twine yielded trace blood under its crust, protected by the fibers where it had wickered and dried. The profile was partial, but enough to exclude billions, and to include one. The match hit with the soft chime of certainty. Marlene Ruiz. The young mother, missing since 1991. Ellen set the lab report beside the SAW photo, the ledger page, the Polaroid of the sandbox at night. 4 voices, 1 chorus. She picked up the phone. "Bring him in," she said. The knock. Raymond Cole opened his shop door to the sudden silhouette of blue windbreakers and badges. He was older now, softened, flecked with gray. Hands still nicked in the old places where blades had once taught him their edge. His eyes moved from face to face with the quick calibration of a man who'd always tested exits first. "Mr. Cole," Ellen said, badge up at her shoulder. "You're under arrest." "For what?" he asked, as if they'd pulled him for a noise complaint. "For what you buried," she answered. "And for who?" He smiled then, a small, curious tilt, as if the punchline had finally arrived after decades in the telling. He didn't resist when they turned him. The cuffs clicked. Outside, wind rattled the chain link. A wind chime scraped one brittle note over and over. As the convoy pulled away, Ellen glanced back at the cinderblock shop. No theatrics, no thunderclap. Just a shed with a door in the floor, a ledger without adjectives, a saw with a tooth missing exactly where the bones said it would be. Cases seldom break with a single revelation. They accumulate like sand until the weight shifts. This one broke that way, under the pressure of small things kept, tiny striations left by a tooth that wasn't there, pollen that stuck where it landed, ink that refused to lie. The sandbox had given up its dead. Now, at last, the living would have to answer. Chapter 10 continued. Trial of Shadows, the courtroom reckoning. The prosecution opened with a display that silenced the courtroom. Photographs of the sandbox excavation glowed on a projector screen. The tiny shoe unearthed alongside bone fragments, the corroded locket clutched in skeletal fingers. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Parents in the audience clutched their children closer. The state's attorney spoke with grim certainty. This was not an accident. This was a burial meant to erase a life and to ensure silence. The defense countered quickly, painting Cole as a scapegoat. They emphasized the passage of time, degraded evidence, and the unreliability of memories decades old. They questioned whether DNA transfers could have been contaminated. To the jury, the defense tried to plant one crucial seed: reasonable doubt. But then came the testimony that shifted the balance. Forensic specialists presented soil analysis proving the body had been buried shortly after the victim's disappearance, in the very years Cole still lived near the playground. DNA recovered from the victim's locket matched his with certainty. Then, the most damning revelation. Inside Cole's cellar, police had found more than bones. They discovered boxes of personal trinkets belonging to other missing women. A rosary, a cracked wristwatch, a faded scarf, still faintly scented of perfume. As these items were laid out in court, families of the victims sobbed openly. Even seasoned jurors turned pale. The trial was no longer about one murder beneath a sandbox. It was about the possibility that Cole had been hiding a cemetery's worth of secrets. The climax arrived with the testimony of a former neighbor. She recalled, in trembling detail, seeing Cole late at night years ago, carrying something heavy into the park grounds, his hands and shirt streaked with dirt. She had dismissed it at the time as strange but harmless. Now, under oath, her voice cracked. "I realize now I was watching him bury her." The jury deliberated less than a day. The verdict, guilty on all counts, rang like a gavel through the town's history. When sentencing came, the judge did not mince words. He condemned Cole as a predator who had turned places of innocence into graves. Life without parole was delivered swiftly. The families, though scarred, felt a measure of justice, though nothing could erase the years of uncertainty. The playground was demolished and rebuilt with new swings, new sand, and a plaque that read, "In memory of those lost. May innocence always be protected." Children's laughter eventually returned, but the shadow of what had been unearthed never fully lifted. The town learned that evil can hide in plain sight, buried beneath laughter, concealed under layers of sand and time. And for those who remembered, the story of the grave beneath the playground remained a chilling reminder that the darkest secrets often lie closest to home.